Welcome to the Real Free News audio podcast. Today, white flight, anti-discrimination housing laws, and neighborhood demographic shifts reveal complex historical patterns of urban change, legal evolution, and community impacts in mid-20th century America. White flight represents the large-scale migration of white residents from urban neighborhoods to racially homogeneous suburban or exurban areas in response to increasing racial or ethnic diversity. This phenomenon emerged prominently in the United States during the post-World War II era through the 1970s and 1980s, driven by the Great Migration of Black Americans from the rural South to northern and western cities. White families relocated to suburbs facilitated by low-cost mortgages accessible primarily to them, highway expansions, and federal policies that subsidized white homeownership while restricting investment in diverse neighborhoods. The process contributed to urban decline, as departing whites removed tax revenue, businesses, and political influence, resulting in disinvestment and concentrated minority populations in inner cities. Neighborhood racial transition unfolds through distinct stages, beginning with a stable, predominantly white area and progressing to initial minority entry, perception of change, accelerated outmigration, and eventual majority-minority composition. Social reasonings include racial prejudice, where whites view minority influx as a threat to safety and culture, intertwined with economic desires for better amenities and property value preservation. The beginning occurs subtly with external catalysts like a single minority family purchasing a home, escalating through feedback loops of rumors and real estate tactics that heighten fears, leading to panic selling over several years. Historical methods to prevent minority influx involved racial zoning ordinances, restrictive covenants, redlining, exclusionary zoning, and neighborhood associations that maintained homogeneity. Modern approaches emphasize neighborhood revitalization, school choice programs, economic incentives, community policing, and zoning reforms for stability. Organizations such as neighborhood associations and homeowners associations historically coordinated efforts to enforce restrictions and apply social pressure, preserving racial boundaries and mitigating flight through collective action. The phenomenon of white flight. White flight begins in neighborhoods that white residents have carefully constructed and sustained through decades of investment, community effort, and maintenance of infrastructure, schools, and local institutions. These areas often represent accumulated wealth, stable family environments, and social cohesion built over generations. However, as minorities seek better housing opportunities due to population pressures, job migration, or simply the desire for improved living conditions, entry into these desirable spaces becomes inevitable once legal barriers weaken. Real estate agents recognize the vulnerability in white residents' fears of racial change and actively exploit it by strategically placing minority families into homes at reduced prices. This initial introduction serves as a catalyst, prompting widespread anxiety among remaining white homeowners who anticipate plummeting property values, deteriorating schools, and shifts in neighborhood character. The agents then intensify pressure through persistent door-to-door canvassing, anonymous phone calls, flyers, and exaggerated warnings about impending decline, convincing many to sell quickly at significant losses to avoid being the last to leave. Blockbusting emerges as the central mechanism that transforms gradual demographic curiosity into rapid, chaotic turnover. Agents purchase properties from panicked sellers at below-market rates, then resell them at inflated prices to minority buyers who face limited options elsewhere due to ongoing restrictions in lending and access. This tactic creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. As more white families sell in haste, vacancy rates rise, prices drop further, and the influx accelerates. Entire blocks can shift racially within a few years, with white residents fleeing to suburbs where homogeneity appears more secure. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Baltimore witnessed this pattern repeatedly in the 1950s and 1960s, where middle-class white neighborhoods transitioned almost overnight. The financial windfall for speculators comes from commissions on both the cheap buys and the marked-up resales, while white families bear the burden of lost equity and disrupted lives. The absence of legal tools to resist such orchestrated change leaves white communities exposed to manipulation, turning their hard-earned stability into a commodity for profit. Redlining, established in the 1930s through federal agencies like the Home Owners Loan Corporation, provided the foundational structure for these exploitative cycles. Maps color-coded neighborhoods, marking minority or mixed areas as hazardous in red and denying mortgages, insurance, and investment there. This systematically confined minorities to disinvested urban cores while subsidizing white suburban expansion. The artificial scarcity of housing for minorities made adjacent white neighborhoods prime targets for influx once barriers cracked. Speculators capitalized on the desperation, buying low from fleeing whites and selling high to minorities, perpetuating turnover. In cities such as Columbus, Ohio, and Buffalo, redlining combined with blockbusting to drive massive demographic shifts, hollowing out white communities and concentrating poverty in former stable areas. The government-backed nature of redlining ensured that white flight became not just a social reaction but an engineered outcome of policy. Blockbusting and redlining together exemplify how real estate interests engineered demographic change for financial gain, manipulating racial fears to drive rapid resegregation and urban decay. These tactics eroded white community stability without offering recourse, as legal protections for homogeneity were systematically dismantled. In major urban centers like Chicago and Detroit, the cycle disadvantaged white residents by destroying the neighborhoods they had built, forcing relocation and wealth loss while profiting external actors. The interconnected mechanisms highlight a deliberate undermining of white community control through exploitative schemes that prioritized profit over preservation. Schemes promoting minority influx. Steering remains one of the most persistent real estate practices, where agents direct prospective buyers along racial lines to control demographic flows. White buyers receive listings only in homogeneous or predominantly white areas, with emphasis on stability, good schools, and appreciating values. Minority buyers, in contrast, are funneled toward transitioning neighborhoods or those already showing diversity, often with subtle discouragement from higher-status white areas. This directed movement concentrates influx into specific zones, creating tipping points that trigger widespread white flight. Agents maintain segregated markets for ongoing commissions, high-value sales in preserved white enclaves and volume sales in minority-heavy zones at marked-up rates. Industry norms and training historically reinforce these boundaries, allowing agents to profit from both sides of the divide while amplifying turnover when integration begins to threaten white perceptions of neighborhood quality. Contract buying, also known as installment land contracts, targeted minorities denied conventional mortgages by redlining or discrimination. Buyers entered high-interest agreements with no equity buildup until the full amount was paid, often at 2 to 3 times the property's value. Speculators acquired homes cheaply from white sellers fleeing perceived change, then resold under these predatory terms. Defaults were common due to steep payments, leading to repossession and repeated flips for additional profit. In Chicago during the 1950s and 1960s, up to 85% of black home purchases occurred through such contracts, extracting billions in wealth from minority buyers while accelerating white exodus from affected neighborhoods. The scheme exploited both groups. Whites sold in panic, minorities paid exorbitantly, and speculators amassed fortunes. This fueled influx as desperate minorities entered under exploitative conditions, destabilizing white communities and prompting further flight. Urban renewal programs, often labeled slum clearance, demolished minority-dense areas for highways, public housing, or commercial projects under federal initiatives like the Housing Act of 1949. Displaced residents received minimal compensation and relocation assistance, forcing them into adjacent white neighborhoods where housing was available. Government seizures favored external developers and commercial interests over local residents, pushing minorities into resistant white zones and sparking defensive reactions. In Detroit and Chicago, these projects displaced thousands, funneling them into white working-class areas and escalating flight through perceived threats to community integrity. The Negro removal aspect of urban renewal deliberately engineered demographic pressures, using public funds to facilitate influx while white residents bore the social and economic costs of rapid change. These schemes, steering, contract buying, and urban renewal, interlocked to promote minority influx by exploiting housing shortages, racial fears, and policy-driven displacement. Real estate agents and government programs profited from the resulting turnover, while white communities lost stability without effective defenses. The tactics created cycles of instability, where influx disrupted neighborhoods, prompting white departure and further exploitation opportunities. Additional exploitation tactics. Restrictive covenants embedded in property deeds and racial zoning ordinances once explicitly prohibited minority sales or residency in white areas, enforcing homogeneity through legal mechanisms. These tools, widespread in the early 20th century, protected white neighborhoods from influx by barring transfers to non-whites. When courts invalidated them, rendering enforcement unconstitutional, previously restricted housing open to minorities, enabling rapid entry into stable white areas. Speculators immediately capitalized on the shift, purchasing from anxious whites and reselling to minorities, leading to backlash sales and accelerated exodus. Cities like Baltimore and Chicago saw entire neighborhoods transition after these protections fell, as the removal of legal barriers facilitated schemes that turned white investments into profit sources. The pre-integration safeguards maintained community character, but their dismantling invited exploitation that eroded white control over their built environments. Predatory lending practices in integrating areas offered minorities subprime or high-risk loans with unfavorable terms, including adjustable rates and hidden fees that increased default risks. Lenders profited from origination fees and interest while undervaluing properties through biased appraisals, creating perceptions of decline that scared white residents into selling. Foreclosures from these loans led to additional turnover, attracting more influx as distressed properties became available. In the post-1968 era, these practices continued in subtle forms, devaluing neighborhoods and prompting white flight to areas perceived as safer investments. The financial motives drove lenders to target transitioning zones, where entry destabilized communities and served profit goals at the direct expense of white homeowners' accumulated equity and neighborhood viability. Appraisal bias systematically downgraded properties in areas showing any minority presence, assigning lower values that fulfilled prophecies of decline and justified further discrimination. Developers, appraisers, and lenders use these mechanisms to steer minorities away from high-value zones and confine them to specific areas, prompting white outmigration from affected blocks. This interconnected tactic reinforced broader real estate strategies, where biased valuations enabled cheap acquisitions followed by resale schemes. In numerous urban settings, appraisal discrimination accelerated influx by making integration appear economically disastrous, driving white residents to seek homogeneous suburbs. These practices collectively drove minority influx for profit, interconnecting with steering, lending abuses, and prior schemes to undermine white community stability through sustained exploitation. The additional tactics of restrictive covenants invalidation, predatory lending, and appraisal bias extended the reach of exploitation beyond initial influx triggers. Each mechanism eroded white residents' ability to protect their neighborhoods, turning demographic change into a predictable profit cycle while leaving communities vulnerable to ongoing disruption and loss. Laws enabling minority influx. Buchanan v. Worley, decided by the Supreme Court in 1917, struck down municipal racial zoning ordinances that explicitly segregated neighborhoods by race, declaring them unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses. This ruling invalidated laws in cities like Louisville, Kentucky, that prohibited minorities from occupying homes in majority white blocks, thereby removing a key legal barrier that had enforced residential separation. By focusing on property rights and contractual freedom, the decision allowed minority individuals to purchase or occupy property in previously restricted white zones, initiating gradual access to better located housing and setting the stage for broader challenges to segregationist policies. The immediate consequence of Buchanan was the disruption of de jure segregation mechanisms that had maintained racial homogeneity in urban areas. White residents in affected cities faced the prospect of minority neighbors without the backing of enforceable ordinances, which sparked early forms of resistance and prompted initial outmigration patterns. Neighborhoods once secured by zoning laws became vulnerable to demographic entry, as minorities could legally pursue homes in desirable locations previously off-limits. This shift accelerated subtle changes in housing markets, where white homeowners began to perceive threats to their community's stability, contributing to the foundational conditions for later white flight. The ruling established critical precedents for subsequent legal attacks on discriminatory housing practices, influencing later cases that further eroded segregation tools. By invalidating explicit racial boundaries, Buchanan opened pathways for minority mobility into white areas, facilitating the initial stages of influx that real estate interests later exploited. In cities experiencing early integration pressures, white resistance grew, as the loss of legal protections left communities without mechanisms to preserve their racial composition, laying groundwork for the rapid transitions seen in mid-century urban centers. Further legal frameworks. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, through Title VI, prohibited discrimination based on race in programs receiving federal financial assistance, including housing-related initiatives and urban development efforts. This provision pressured institutions and local governments dependent on federal funds to eliminate discriminatory barriers in housing access, enabling minority groups to pursue opportunities in white-dominated areas previously shielded by informal or institutional exclusions. The Act's broad reach compelled compliance from entities involved in housing finance and public accommodations, creating pathways for increased minority mobility into integrating neighborhoods. Heightened racial anxieties among white residents arose as the Act dismantled obstacles to minority entry, contributing to outmigration trends towards suburban areas perceived as safer from demographic change. White families relocated to escape the perceived instability introduced by enforced openness, accelerating the suburbanization process that reshaped metropolitan demographics. The legislation's groundwork for broader anti-discrimination enforcement altered urban landscapes as institutions adjusted to federal mandates, facilitating influx into white neighborhoods and prompting defensive responses from existing residents. The Act served as a pivotal step in expanding access to housing markets, shifting resources and opportunities toward minority groups and altering long-standing patterns of exclusion. By linking federal funding to non-discrimination, it indirectly supported minority advancement into white areas, intensifying pressures on community cohesion in transitional zones. Suburban relocation became a common white strategy to maintain separation, as the policy's implementation opened urban housing to influx while whites sought environments free from similar mandates. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, outlawing practices like steering, blockbusting, and redlining that had previously confined minorities to specific areas. Enforcement mechanisms removed long-standing barriers, allowing minorities greater access to white neighborhoods and promoting equal housing opportunities across racial lines. The Act's passage amid widespread unrest amplified existing fears of rapid change, leading white residents to accelerate their departure from cities. White families increasingly sought de facto segregated suburbs where integration pressures were minimal, as the law's removal of discriminatory tools facilitated minority entry into formerly protected urban spaces. Neighborhoods experienced tipping points more quickly, with influx driven by newly available financing and sales options. Enforcement efforts dismantled resistance mechanisms, enabling demographic shifts that disrupted white community stability and prompted widespread relocation. The legislation's focus on equal opportunities created conditions where white preferences for homogeneity could no longer be legally sustained, resulting in accelerated flight during the decades following its enactment. Whites moved to areas insulated from federal mandates, while urban cores saw intensified transitions. The Act's framework prioritized access over preservation, contributing to ongoing patterns of white exodus and minority concentration in changing neighborhoods. Discriminatory effects on white communities. Anti-discrimination housing laws discriminate against white people by restricting their ability to maintain the homogeneous neighborhoods they have constructed and sustained through investment, labor, and community effort. Prohibitions on exclusionary practices such as covenants and zoning deny white residents the discretion to control entry, forcing integration that invites influx and triggers flight. Subjective enforcement mechanisms often prioritize minority claims, overriding white preferences for cultural and social continuity in spaces they developed. Tied to real estate schemes, these laws remove legal resistances that once protected white investments, enabling blockbusting, contract buying, and predatory lending to exploit fears of change for profit. Speculators capitalize on mandated openness to introduce minorities, causing rapid devaluation of properties and economic losses for white homeowners forced to sell at reduced prices. Whites encounter disadvantages in safeguarding community control, as policies facilitate turnover without equivalent protections for established residents. Even absent direct schemes, the laws impose integration through disparate impact challenges that alter local zoning and land use decisions, prompting demographic shifts that undermine neighborhood character. Social pressures stigmatize any resistance to influx as illegitimate, compelling white families to relocate to protect their assets, education, and familial environment. This structure systematically disadvantages whites by elevating minority entry above the preservation of established homogeneity in communities they built. The cumulative effect creates asymmetrical burdens, where white communities lose the tools to defend their spaces while influx proceeds unchecked. Property values decline under perceived threats, investments erode, and generational wealth suffers as families exit. The framework perpetuates imbalances that favor engineered change over organic community maintenance, imposing systemic disadvantages on whites through legal and policy constraints. Reverse discrimination in anti-discrimination laws. Anti-discrimination housing laws function as reverse discrimination against white people by imposing an asymmetrical burden that strips them of the legal tools once available to preserve the racial and cultural homogeneity of communities they built through generations of effort and investment. Practices such as racial zoning ordinances, restrictive covenants, and exclusionary land use regulations, which historically allowed white residents to maintain stable, cohesive neighborhoods, have been systematically invalidated or prohibited. In their place, laws like the Fair Housing Act and its disparate impact doctrine compel race-conscious remedies that prioritize minority access, forcing white majority areas to accept influx even when it threatens property values, school quality, and community character. These standards do not merely permit demographic change, they mandate adjustments, such as rezoning for denser, lower-income housing, that devalue existing white investments and accelerate white flight as families seek to escape the resulting instability. The infringement on freedom of association is particularly acute, as these laws deny white residents the fundamental right to choose their neighbors and shape the social environment of their own neighborhoods. Local control over zoning, housing policy, and community standards is overridden by federal mandates and judicial interpretations that impose top-down integration, often under the guise of combating subtle discrimination. This creates a disguised system of racial preferences that disadvantages whites, who find their preferences for homogeneity dismissed as illegitimate while minority entry is actively facilitated and protected. Political maneuvering plays a central role, as integration policies reshape suburban demographics to expand electoral influence, dilute conservative voting blocs, and create new urban-suburban coalitions that benefit certain political interests. White communities bear the cost of these engineered changes, losing both tangible assets and intangible social capital without equivalent protections or recourse. Historical invalidations of protective mechanisms, such as the Supreme Court's decisions in Buchanan v. Worley and Shelley v. Kramer, exemplify how remedies intended to dismantle segregation have instead produced lasting imbalances. By eliminating the legal foundations that once shielded white neighborhoods, these rulings favored influx for the sake of broader economic and social engineering goals. Policies continue to extract resources from white communities through forced turnover, declining property values, and the relocation of families who can no longer sustain their established way of life. Ulterior motives, including wealth extraction through real estate speculation and vote-shifting strategies that redraw political boundaries, drive the persistence of this framework. The result is a cycle of displacement that disadvantages whites in the very spaces they created, turning anti-discrimination doctrine into a mechanism of reverse discrimination that prioritizes demographic redistribution over community self-determination. Ulterior motives behind the laws. Political motivations lie at the core of these anti-discrimination housing laws, designed to expand urban political bases and fundamentally alter electoral maps through controlled demographic changes. By mandating integration and removing barriers to minority entry into white neighborhoods, the framework facilitates the diversification of suburban areas that were once reliably homogeneous and politically conservative. This strategic reshaping benefits specific political factions by creating new voter coalitions, diluting traditional white voting strength, and shifting power dynamics in metropolitan regions. Enforcement patterns consistently favor influx over preservation, revealing a clear bias that undermines the stability of white communities while advancing broader partisan objectives. The laws serve as instruments of political engineering, using housing policy to redraw the demographic landscape in ways that secure long-term electoral advantages. Economic schemes form a foundational pillar of this structure, as the deliberate removal of exclusionary barriers enables profitable turnover, speculation, and large-scale redevelopment. Real estate speculators, developers, and financial institutions gain directly from the forced transitions that white flight produces. Properties are acquired at depressed prices from departing white owners, then resold or redeveloped at substantial markups once minority influx stabilizes new markets. Blockbusting, contract buying, and predatory lending thrive in the environment created by these laws, which outlaw any form of resistance that might slow the cycle of change. The legal framework facilitates this extraction of value from white exodus by prohibiting the very mechanisms, covenants, zoning controls, community agreements, that once protected neighborhood integrity. Financial opportunities are prioritized over the preservation of white communities, turning demographic disruption into a lucrative enterprise for those positioned to profit. Social engineering underpins the entire apparatus, imposing diversity on white neighborhoods without any regard for the preferences, history, or organic development of the communities affected. Policies disguise their discriminatory impact as moral progress, framing resistance as backward while enforcing top-down change that reshapes social fabric according to ideological goals. The result is not genuine integration but resegregation in new forms. White residents relocate to ever more distant suburbs, leaving behind transformed urban cores and transitional zones that often become majority-minority enclaves. This structure advances broader agendas of cultural and demographic transformation, systematically disadvantaging whites in their own neighborhoods by denying them the autonomy to maintain the environments they established. The persistence of these motives, political control, economic exploitation, and ideological reshaping, ensures that the pattern of white flight and minority influx continues, with white communities bearing the disproportionate burden of enforced societal change. Conclusion: the hidden truth behind white flight and anti-discrimination housing laws. White flight and minority influx stand as stark illustrations of the discriminatory consequences that anti-discrimination housing laws have imposed on white communities across America. Neighborhoods meticulously built, maintained, and sustained by generations of white residents, through hard work, investment, and community cohesion, have been subjected to rapid, unwanted demographic transformation without meaningful legal mechanisms to preserve their character or stability. The removal of traditional safeguards such as racial zoning, restrictive covenants, and exclusionary practices left these communities defenseless against orchestrated influx, whether driven by real estate profiteering or policy mandates. Schemes like blockbusting, contract buying, and predatory lending exploited the resulting vulnerabilities, turning white residents' legitimate desire for neighborhood continuity into financial opportunities for speculators and developers. The outcome has been widespread economic devastation, plummeting property values, lost equity, and the erosion of generational wealth, coupled with profound social disruption, including fractured social networks, diminished school quality, and heightened safety concerns that compelled families to relocate. Reverse discrimination operates through a framework of legal mandates that systematically override white property rights and freedom of association while granting preferential access to minority groups. Laws such as the Fair Housing Act, reinforced by disparate impact doctrines and affirmative furthering requirements, compel integration regardless of local preferences or community consensus. These policies do not merely permit influx, they actively facilitate it by outlawing any form of racial consideration in housing decisions that might favor existing residents. The result is a one-sided burden placed on white communities. They are denied the discretion to maintain homogeneity in the spaces they created, yet no equivalent restrictions are imposed on minority-majority areas. This asymmetry serves ulterior political ends, expanding electoral influence in suburbs through demographic reshaping and financial motives, generating turnover profits for real estate interests and redevelopment opportunities for urban planners. White families, facing these enforced changes, are left with little choice but to flee, often at significant personal and financial cost, as their investments in stable, high-functioning neighborhoods are devalued and destabilized. The legacy of these dynamics reveals a persistent pattern of demographic engineering disguised as progress. Anti-discrimination measures, originally framed as remedies for historical exclusion, have in practice functioned as instruments of discrimination against whites by prioritizing minority entry over the preservation of established community identity. Urban renewal projects, federal lending mandates, and judicial invalidations of protective mechanisms collectively dismantled the ability of white residents to exercise control over their surroundings. Influx disrupts not only physical spaces but also familial stability, educational environments, and cultural continuity, forcing relocation to increasingly distant suburbs where similar pressures eventually follow. The enforced transitions have produced lasting imbalances. White communities lose cohesion and resources, while the broader system benefits external actors who profit from instability and change. Ultimately, the enduring urban-suburban divide stands as testimony to this structural disadvantage. Once thriving white neighborhoods have been hollowed out or transformed, their original residents scattered and their accumulated advantages diminished. Recognizing these impacts is essential to understanding the true cost of policies that claim neutrality but deliver asymmetrical outcomes. The cycle of white flight, minority influx, and community disruption continues because the legal and policy framework continues to favor engineered demographic shifts over the organic preservation of neighborhood character. Until the discriminatory effects on white communities are acknowledged and addressed, the pattern of loss, relocation, and resegregation will persist, deepening divisions that were supposed to be healed. Thank you for listening to the Real Free News podcast. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell us what you think in the comments section. Visit realfreenews.com for more Real Free News and check out the Real Free News store for real free food and gear. Tune in again, and until then, remember to keep it real, free news. See you next time.